Right, so here's a story of corruption, nepotism and affiliation to foreign interests so grotesque it could only happen in Starmer's Labour. And it isn't just any old Labour backbencher here allegedly up to their neck in dubiousness and a dodgy deal. It's literally someone he made a minister, and someone this year, due to serious events happening abroad, who has already been in the public frame. But yet it again underlines just what an awful bunch of people the Labour right are. Because it seems they can say one thing and do another with impunity. Somebody really ought to involve their corruption minister, frankly. Actually, you might be surprised to learn that Starmer even has such a thing. You'd imagine they'd be worked off their feet as a result, though. Although that would require them being dedicated to rooting out actual corruption, of course. The bigger problem for Starmer, though, is that that very same corruption minister is the person at the centre of this latest corruption scandal. Yes, it can only happen to Starmer. The Labour right. They really are the very worst of politicians. Right, so what's going on this time then, Damo? Who is the corruption minister now seemingly embroiled in corruption and giving Starmer a head-splitting migraine over it? Well, it is Tulip Siddiq, all 4'11" of her, the MP for Hampstead and Highgate, Economic Secretary to the Treasury and Corruption Minister by extension of that role, since her Treasury role includes regulation of corruption within the financial sector, so quite specific therefore, but if anything, even more relevant, as it is now she who is at the centre of a corruption scandal and finances are involved. Siddiq had only just got over a, let's say, more minor scandal in the grand scheme of things, having been placed under investigation in July of this year by the Parliamentary Standards Watchdog. The very same month she, of course, gained a ministerial post, Labour winning the general election. Just July, wasn't it? For apparently not declaring rental income she was receiving, though she was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing, as MPs seem too often to get away with for not keeping up with their paperwork, and always begging the question, would they have corrected the record unless they got caught? All very embarrassing, I'm sure, though for a newly minted corruption minister to be seen to be potentially on the make, all the worse. Still, all settled in the end. Now, for those unfamiliar with Tulip Siddiq, her family is rather famous, and this fame strikes to the heart of the problems she finds herself allegedly in now. How famous? Well, as a child she travelled the world, met all kinds of foreign dignitaries and world leaders, her parents being a former university professor who met her mother while she was being granted political asylum from Bangladesh here in the UK. I'm going to park that there for a moment, though, for dramatic emphasis. Bangladesh is a country that has seen significant turmoil this year. Its leadership got deposed following the introduction of legislation that would severely impact freedom of speech and expression. Bangladesh's Digital Security Act had been used to threaten and silence journalists, critics, human rights campaigners and more through the additional powers the police were given through that act. Peaceful assembly, demonstration, protest has seen the police arrive and meet them not only with arrests but with tear gas, rubber bullets, and in fact on one protest on the 18th of July last year, live ammunition was used, resulting in one person's death. Now, we haven't seen measures that extreme here in the UK, but some of that might ring a bell. There are other reports from Amnesty International on forced disappearances under the now former Bangladeshi regime, extrajudicial executions, torture, clamping down on workers' rights, and of course when it comes to that so often broached topic of migrants and refugees, for the last 7 years now Bangladesh has been a home to 1 million Rohingya refugees kept in appalling conditions in Bangladesh, having fled even worse conditions in Myanmar. Bangladesh is not a country in a good state that has been run well for the majority of the people, and things took a turn for the even worse, spilling over into civil unrest, to the point the Prime Minister of Bangladesh of the last 15 years, Sheikh Hasina, fled the country. I suppose in no small way does this reflect on how damaging it can be for one party and one person, in fact, to remain in power for so long. But Hasina came to power for the second time as it happens. She'd already been Prime Minister from 1996 to 2001 previously, leading her Awami League to victory in 2009, and had stayed there ever since. And both the party and her at the helm remained there. Until she was forced to flee, that was, earlier this year. Her autocratic regime finally fell on the 5th of August. Sheikh Hasina is Tulip Siddiq's aunt. Her mother, Sheikh Rahana, was an Awami League politician who fled with her sister Hasina and was in hiding from the former Bangladeshi regime previously in the UK back in the late 70s, early 80s, where she'd sought asylum at that point, and that's when she met Siddiq's father. Now, of course, Tulip Siddiq is a UK politician. She was born in London. She has always distanced herself, in her words, from Bangladeshi politics, despite her famous roots. Her grandfather is basically considered the father of modern Bangladesh. But her aunt ran a coercive regime, an oppressive regime. Her mother was part of that. And it makes you wonder about Tulip Siddiq's thinking too, therefore. And actually it is her denial of Bangladeshi links that brings us to the scandal she's now apparently involved in, which really does make a mockery of her position as corruption minister, if there is anything in this. Naturally, the mainstream media have given this some coverage. A whiff of scandal in the air, and they're on it like flies on Keir Starmer policy. And yes, that was a euphemism. Here's an excerpt from what The Independent had to say. A Labour minister has been named in an investigation that claims her family embezzled up to £3.9 billion from infrastructure projects in Bangladesh. Tulip Siddiq, who as the Treasury's Economic Secretary is responsible for tackling corruption in UK financial markets, is alleged to have brokered a deal with Russia in 2013 for a new nuclear power plant in Bangladesh that saw £1 billion siphoned off into private hands. The allegation is part of a wider investigation by Bangladesh's Anti-Corruption Commission, ACC, into Siddiq's aunt, Sheikh Hasina, the recently deposed Prime Minister of the country who fled to India in August. Siddiq has been approached for comment. The Labour Party has declined to comment. The investigation is based on a series of allegations made by Bobby Hajjaj, a senior political opponent of Hasina. The ACC is also investigating several of Hasina's family members, including Siddiq's mother, Sheikh Rahana Siddiq, and senior officials from her government. Hasina, who was in charge of Bangladesh for more than 20 years, was seen as an autocrat whose government ruthlessly clamped down on dissent. Since fleeing the country, Hasina has been accused of multiple crimes by the new Bangladeshi government. Now, for as much as you can expect political opponents to make a lot out of not necessarily much at all, the fact Hasina's track record ended up warranting an Amnesty International investigation, as touched on earlier, speaks a lot more loudly to her being every bit what her political opponents are accusing her of being, and why she was essentially run out of Bangladesh, ostensibly by an uprising amongst the country's student population. But the fact this allegedly goes back to 2013, to a deal with Russia, and the involvement of a British Labour MP who incidentally once worked for Amnesty International. Siddiq didn't become an MP until 2015, so all of these allegations actually predate her time as an MP, but they do coincide with her time as a Labour councillor on Camden Borough Council, and it was also the same year she was selected to stand for Parliament at that. The optics of all of this are obviously scandalous. Billions of pounds we're talking about here. Labour's corruption minister, responsible for regulating financial corruption, has been named in a multi-billion-pound Bangladeshi embezzlement case. Will Starmer suspend her, therefore, pending the outcome? Will he leave her in charge of examining financial corruption in the UK when she's become embroiled in such a case herself abroad? Because surely that is the only alternative. If he doesn't, and she is found guilty of some kind of wrongdoing, it will strike to the heart of Labour's own financial credibility. And when you again bring up the example of him having suspended left-leaning Labour MPs for voting against impoverishing children, but does nothing here, well, when I started out by saying how grotesque the Labour right are, you can kind of see my point now, can't you? Meanwhile, of course, from one case of financial irregularity to another, Starmer's decision to dump the waspy women and their compensation claim, now they are no longer a useful election tool to him, strikes very much to that same grotesquerie presented by the Labour right. But it's even worse than that. Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do like, share and subscribe to support the channel if you so wish and haven't done so already. That is massively appreciated. And I will hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.